Hey, good morning. Today is Sunday, September 13th, and I thought I'd put up a little video lecture discussion, kind of pretend I'm in front of the classroom, just summarizing the information I think that was important from chapter two. Wish you could be there to interact a little bit more. I know some of you like to do live Zoom classes. I found those to be very, very challenging, either because of technology or simply to get the information done in a reasonable period of time. That doesn't mean, and I'm serious, some of you already out. I can't get to the book. I'm having trouble with this. What's expected of me on that? I can't figure out how to submit the homework. I'm glad you're not afraid to contact me. Don't ever think you're bothering me, especially if it's about substantive stuff. Like, hey, Corman, he did this lecture thing and he didn't seem to talk about this very much at all. I wanted to understand this concept deeper or that concept deeper, or I'm not sure that you were really that correct on some aspect and I want to talk about it more. So don't ever be afraid to reach out. But chapter two, colliding cultures, it's getting a little bit more in terms of historical knowledge being accurate, although written by the victors, of course. But in terms of our understanding of the events that occurred during the early colonialization process, there's a lot of information to delve into, a lot of what we call primary sources, letters, and um, obviously not videos of what occurred, but letters and historical journals and things that were kept contemporaneous with the times that we know probably reflect many of the major events that occurred during this era. We know that during this period of time, we're talking about obviously after Columbus came and discovered what he called the West Indies, the Caribbean, the Bahamas, those areas. We know there's going to be an influx of other countries, but Spain, for a while, almost has an uncontested um, um, sort of dibs on the New World, for lack of a better way of saying it. And they're delving deep into the area of the Yucatan, Mexico, parts of South America, and certainly starting to go all the way up into the Southwest United States and even into the Florida Panhandle. What's interesting, the book does allude to it, but I always found it fascinating, was I always thought the Spanish Empire was so big into the New World. They pretty much had it all, and somehow it just sort of faded away later through competition with Europe. Well, they never really did get the foothold that other nations, especially England and France, got, and the Dutch even on a smaller level. But they didn't do the colonization process the same way, and they never really had major success with expanding the Spanish influence in these areas. Their hold, although broad, was often very tenuous, and I think that's an interesting part of history. It lasted for a long time in many regions, but it was always um, after all the gold and silver and great wealth was taken by the Aztecs and the Incas and the other societies that they encountered, they did very poorly when it came to things like crops and getting other um, um, resources out of the New World. It was actually a bit of a financial burden in later decades than it was initially off the offset. So it's pretty interesting. So Spanish America, they talk about all the different travelers. You should know who Ponce de Leon is. The book does a nice job. You don't need to hear me regurgitating things that are pretty much straightforward. Um, and they talk about where the different Spanish settlers occurred and how they intermarried. Many of the Spanish that came over weren't like Spanish families and like economic units like that. In fact, it was mostly Spanish men, and they often intermarried with many of the natives, and they created different caste systems, really racially based. I mean, when you think about racism and the way different races have been treated, and it's certainly in the news today, it's always been in the news on some level if you really paid attention. A lot of the historical events of the creation of our what we think of as modern America has roots in significant racist ideology and um, programs of cultural stratification. There's no question about it. And the Spanish were doing that significantly, and we know that from chapter one. That was referenced in there as well. But then we get into the next part of the chapter, and it talks about Spain's rivals that emerge. And what's interesting, how did the Spanish treat Native Americans? We know, generally speaking, not universally, but generally speaking, bar, as barbarians, treated very, very poorly, very, very much in a form of domination. Although disease killed more than any other aspect of the Spanish inroads into the New World, they also weren't afraid to use barbaric tactics. In fact, other European countries that start competing with Spain's interest in the New World actually foster a certain degree of mythology about how brutal the Spanish inroads were into the New Americans, how Native Americans were treated. There's enough truth to it, anyways. But there was a term, and I knew I underlined it. I believe it's called the uh, yeah, it's the bloody course, a faithful narrative of the horrid and unexampled massacres, butcheries, all manners of cruelties were done by the Spanish, and they tried to blame it. You have to remember that the Protestant Reformation was occurring this time, so many of the competitors in Europe were either Catholic or they were Protestant reformers under Martin Luther and the Anglican Church, which is different, but they're still Protestant. They were trying to say the reason why the Spanish were so brutal to the Native Americans and so cruel and so barbaric was because they were under the thumb of the Pope, and the Pope is evil and Catholicism is evil. There were plenty of probably legit Spanish missionaries that believed in humanitarian outcomes, but there's a lot. There's no question it was barbarian. I don't want to try to put any justification at all. But did the other European countries try to foster a belief that the Spanish were really like the Darth Vader of their time? Yeah, absolutely. And that became part of the black legend. I love that term, the black legend, of how the Spanish really created unbelievable barbarities to the Native American people. It's true enough. There's no question about it. But the French, now I'm going to kind of going along with the way the book, the French, they had inroads mostly into the border really between what we consider modern day United States and Canada, Nova Scotia, not only fishery but fur trading. They had they weren't there to really engage in conquest, as they were much were looking for new avenues to make great wealth. And those trading companies came over and had a very different relationship with Native Americans. I'm not saying that was all purely equitable and equal and fair, but they did have a much more symbiotic relationship. The Native Americans often benefiting from European technologies and actually benefiting economically from the trade in furs with the French. And we'll see that later when some of the conflicts break out between the French and the British, how the different Native American groups would ally with one another based upon the previous treatments they got. I'm not saying the French were by any means purely egalitarian. They were out to make a buck, and they would take advantage probably of the Native Americans a great realm. But the history there is a little bit more salutary. I can't say that because it's still negative, but when you contrast the Spanish towards the French, there's really a huge different outcome, both in perspective in terms of how they expected to treat the Native Americans and the actual reality. So they come over and they're going to be up in the Hudson River Valley, and they end up going down the Mississippi, and they develop obviously developments in New Orleans, and that's the French always had this kind of neat sort of way in which their influence was significant all along the Great Lakes and southern Canada, but also all the way down the Ohio River Valley into especially New Orleans. And it created this interesting, mix of different influences from different sections of the European continent. The Dutch, very, very small country, but very, very powerful, very, very wealthy. What's interesting, we talk about the Puritans a little bit in this chapter later. We talk about how they were fleeing what they determined to be lack of moral guidance by the Anglican Church, and that's why they got the name. It was actually a prerogative. They were making fun of them by calling them Puritans because they wanted such a perfect implementation of religion in every aspect of their lives. They initially, because they were being persecuted, or felt persecuted in England proper, many of them fled initially to the Netherlands. And why they didn't feel like it worked, which is really interesting, was the Dutch nation, although ruled by an oligarchy at the time, it wasn't like it was democratic, but it was a bit of a I don't want to call it hippie, but it was a very progressive society, and in terms of sexual mores, in terms of family relationships, in terms of liberties. There was a great deal of civil liberties in the Dutch community, such that the Puritans that tried to live among them, they were welcome. They say, "Hey, you guys, you get persecuted over in England, come over to the Netherlands. You can stay here," and they did, but they couldn't feel like they could raise their families in a community of such open mores, if you will. But I always found that fast. But Dutch were very, very successful in terms of both sea power, but also great wealth. They were very, very successful. And where did they go over and settle? Well, New York was New Amsterdam initially. Manhattan and New York City, all that area was initially settled by the Dutch, and they had a different vision than the French and the Spanish, because they brought over family units, and they were there to stay. But again, it was about trade. It was about making money. The Dutch did not come over for religious freedom. And I don't know why I was taught this, but maybe because I was a kid, and I don't know, I probably pretty crappy teachers. I always thought the New World was entirely based upon religious freedom. A big part of it is about religious tolerance that we wanted for our own. If I was a Puritan or later Congregationalist, or I was a Quaker, or I was another Huguenots, those are the French Catholics, French Protestants, whatever the group was, they came over for their own religious freedom, but not for others. They didn't want to tolerate anybody else. It's kind of interesting. We didn't come over and create a new world because we wanted this beautiful society where everyone was tolerated. They just wanted to find toleration for themselves, but they were quick to be intolerant to others. But we'll get to that later. But anyways, the Dutch settled New York. They bought Manhattan from a Native American group, a name I cannot pronounce. There's an argument that it was probably a Native American group that really wasn't playing any legal claim to Manhattan. They might have been dealing with the wrong Native American group, but even no matter what Native American group was, the concept of selling, an island or land or an area was a bit foreign to them. So there was a real question: did they really know what they were getting into? Because they had this philosophy of active use. It isn't about own it while you occupy it, but it's free for other people to use. You can't own land. It's part of a shared entity. It can't be done. But the Dutch did actually think that they were very enlightened in the way in which they dealt with Native Americans. They did contracts when they bought land, and they insisted upon it. And the Dutch were unusual in that they had such libertine and very broad civic rights for their citizens, but they were the ones that really first introduced, I shouldn't say first, but one of the early introducers of African-American slave trade to the country, because they had a difficult time. The Dutch were thriving back in the Netherlands. Why would, the importation or the immigration wasn't as much a pull as a push and pull as it was for some of the other nations. They had a tough time getting workers to come over. Indentured servitude was popular, meaning, hey, I want to go to the New World. I'll go over. I'll work for you for 7 years. Basically being at your discretion for that 7 years, but then I earn my freedom after that. Some of that was initially true even of the African-American slaves. So they were obviously captured. It's still slavery, but many of them would receive freedom after a period of time, and they can actually, although probably treated unfairly as inferiors in term, but they were allowed to own property and own businesses, and some of them actually did quite well afterwards. But it's still slavery. But slavery evolves. There's a difference. Boy, it's hard to argue. It's like evil's evil, right? Slavery is wrong no matter what. But these early slave of Native American people and early African Americans introduced by the Dutch and the Portuguese really had a different conception in the Northeast and up in that region and in South America than it did in the south of the United States. A very different concept of the totalitarianism of slavery it was in the southern part of what we consider today's modern United States. So the Dutch came over, very, very successful for a short period of time. They weren't there to conquer. French, Dutch, not there to conquer. They're there to exploit, trade, economic viability. And again, they weren't there entirely, not so much the Dutch and not even so much the French, but all of them still felt like the groups that they were encountering had some inferiority in terms of religious exposure. So all of them were both doing for money, God, and country on some level. The Spanish believed it was the glorification of God and for exploitation as well. And then the Portuguese ended up mostly where? Well, they came to North America too, but they mostly they're big on the slave trade, but they end up mostly in not modern day Brazil. And that's why today I always think it interesting when I meet somebody. I've had several Brazilian students in my class, and people are naive, and they judge a book by the cover. And they'll see somebody, and they'll look at them, and they'll start speaking to them in Spanish. And then the person will be like, "Hey, I don't speak Spanish." He goes, "Oh, you look like you're a Latino." And he goes, "No, I'm from Brazil." And the person will say, "Well, don't you speak Spanish from Brazil?" He goes, "No, we speak Portuguese." And that's based upon history, because the Portuguese were basically the colonizers of the giant nation of Brazil, and that's why it's still, I believe, and I don't know if it's the only language, but it's certainly the national language of Brazil to this day, Portuguese. Very interesting. I always found it very interesting because like to think I don't judge a book by its cover and stereotype, but if it wasn't for taking history classes and I met somebody from Brazil, I might think they speak Spanish as well too. But they might. There's actually, they may have the ability to speak Spanish, because Portugal and Spain are the languages aren't necessarily so, for lack of a better word, foreign to one another, but they are different. There's no question about it. And again, they had a different conception of the nature of slavery. Not, I don't know how to make it sound like there's good slavery and there's bad slavery, but in terms of brutality and totalitarianism and permanence, the Dutch, the Portuguese, and the French, very little, had a very, very different conception of the permanency and the character of the way in which treatment would occur. It was the southern part of the United States when African American, they weren't called Americans at the time, but African slaves were brought in, the brutality and the totality of it really changed in its nature and scope. But English colonization, where does it start? We got to get to Jamestown. I don't want these videos to go too long, but I tend to go on forever and ever. We know there were some earlier ones, the Roanoke Island mystery, where everybody disappeared because they couldn't get back for several years because of whether it was weather or expense and things like that. And when they came back, there was only one thing that was written in a they don't even put that much in the book about it, but I always found it a fascinating piece of history. Somebody supposedly think they solved it right now. I think the word, it was Croton, and it was carved into a tree or a post, and they think that was related to a Native American group. And they think, some people think that they may have assimilated back into the Native Americans. I find that there's no language left. There was nobody that spoke part, English and Native American dialects. I don't know if you can tell by look, it wasn't just a lot of people out there with, fairer skin or blue eyes and things like that. Very deep mystery. A lot of people like to speculate. There's some anthropologists, I think, from England came to a new theory about it. I don't know if it was just to make the news, but it didn't seem very plausible to me. It's unknown, probably stay unknown forever. But why did the English, they're late to the game. Spanish are first, but again, they're broad, got a lot of control. Much of what we think of Central America, parts of the southwest of the United States, Florida, they seem like they're in control. But it's starting to wane a little bit. It's no longer financially as viable to them. It's actually getting costly for them to be into the New World. But they're the dominant ones. They have the biggest navy. They're the most powerful in Europe. But Great Britain is starting to gain some strength. And so what happens with Great Britain, they are envious and jealous. And they're also what? They're not Catholic anymore. They're Anglican. They're a type of Protestant faith. And so there's this underlying religious tension too. And again, they want to go after that, the black legend of what the Spanish were doing. We have to get over there too. But there was a push and a pull, meaning that not only did the English want to go over and get monetary interest out of it, but later, a second wave, very shortly after the first, isn't about economics. It's about trying to remove people that are vagabonds, that are poor, or they're suffering from religious persecution. Better to have all these people dealing with strife back in England. Let's let them go over to the New World and start new. And those are the Pilgrims here in Massachusetts. But initially, the first permanent settlement, if you will, is Jamestown, just outside of Virginia. And what are they looking for? Are they going to plant stuff? Are they going to start a new world? Is it about spreading the gospel of Puritanism? No, they're looking for money. They're looking for gold. In fact, if you really get into the history of Jamestown, it's fascinating that the ships that came over to Jamestown, it's like a peninsula, almost an island in the bay off of Virginia, the worst piece of land you could possibly select. I wonder why the Native Americans weren't there. They didn't feel like they had to push anybody off or negotiate with anybody about the location. Native Americans knew better. It was ripe with disease-bearing insects. The water was brackish, basically unfit for human consumption. The soil was poor for any kind of planting. We couldn't pick a worse site. It was awful. And what was the success rate? It was unbelievable. There's some theories that something like 90% of all the people that brought over during the first 5 years die, and not because of war. They die from starvation or disease. Really an awful experience. And what did they come over with in the first ships? I love this story. Everyone that came over were out there. They were like gold speculators. They bought tools for gold mining and I don't know if they did panning back then, but all the different metal processes for reaping these big gold deposits that were going to be out there in Virginia. They found none of it, and they didn't bring any, almost none really, people that knew about agriculture and planting and husbandry. It was a complete fiasco. In fact, the Native Americans, and sometimes everyone thinks there's this big negative story between Native Americans and the New World settlers. Some of it's actually quite humanitarian, beautiful, and it was the Powhatan Indians, one of which is Pocahontas, of course. They actually, the reason why they survived, how little they did survive from year to year, was largely from the Native Americans keeping them alive. So there was some good early symbiotic relationship. It really changes when the colonization becomes so rampant that Native Americans are losing, traditional hunting lands and agricultural lands to the exclusion of their use, that they feel, that they're wiped out 90% of them by disease, that the acrimony and the competition between the two groups really develop, not to mention that they're viewed as heathens by the English. That's another issue too. So Jamestown, complete fiasco. It's a nightmare, but they keep trying to come back, bringing a new life, bringing new things, and then none of it's really good. And we know the story of John Smith, the son of one of the earlier settlers. He's quite an interesting character in history. He's about to be killed by the Powhatan chief. I can't remember his name, but we know his daughter's name, right? Pocahontas. Donald Trump always calls our own state U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren Pocahontas, because she claimed that she was a part Native American, and maybe it wasn't as accurate, but that's the story she was told. I'm not going to get into legitimacy or not legitimacy, but a lot of Native Americans get offended by that term. But Pocahontas did not marry John Smith. A lot of people think, oh, that's who she hooks up with marriage. She might have hooked up with him, I don't know. But she saves him from execution. John Smith actually helps develop a better working relationship with the Powhatan tribe in the Virginia area. And she marries a guy named Ralph, another friend, Englishman. She actually goes back to England. She becomes a cause celeb over there. And she really helps foster, for a period of time, a very good relationship between early English settlers in the Virginia region and Native American tribes. But the Powhatan tribes also had competitors. And that's one of the interesting things we get to in the later chapters, is why aren't the Native Americans more successful in repelling all the, especially English advancements into colonial eras, and clearly Native American, why can't they whip ass, for lack of a better way of saying it? Because they're not one unified group. Many of them are competing against each other. So some of them will actually ally themselves with the English settlers or the French in order to gain competition. So they're a dispersed group, and they don't have the wherewithal to unite until later, when it's really too late that they get an opportunity to unite. Much later, in 1800s, and really it's too late. So what happens? What changes in Virginia? Well, one, just before Virginia starts, the Spanish are done. Why? The Spanish are upset. The English are starting to come over. They're competing. So I think it's 1588, the famous Spanish Armada is going to go up and invade England, and they're going to go up there. And England's English Navy isn't as big, but it's very, for lack of a better word, very worldly. The English Navy, they're an island nation. Their Navy was very, very competent in terms of sailing skills, and their boats were smaller, but they were faster and more maneuverable. And so initially, when the huge Spanish Armada comes out there to crush England as a European power, it looks like lights out for England. They underestimated the English Navy's ability. They start losing some of the initial battles, and I don't recall what the name of the battle was, but they retreat to, they try to retreat to the ports of Netherlands, where they have a friendly port from the English. And then a storm, an unbelievable sea storm comes up. I think they called it the Divine Wind, I think in the book somewhere was it called. I should know it anyways. But the Divine Wind comes, and the Divine Wind basically wipes out the entire remainder of the Spanish Armada. It's all over. And now it's basically competition with the English, the Dutch, and the French. The Spanish, they're going to hold on to what they have, but they're not going to be able to repel the English from coming in to these settlements. So what happens in Jamestown? Well, for 5 years, it's just a complete nightmare. I mean, my kids sometimes watch horror movies, and they're really pretty disgusting, like zombie type stuff. I don't know, I find them boring. But if you want to talk about horror, I don't know why someone's not making a horror movie about Jamestown, because these people starve to death. And when you starve to death, you start doing some really weird stuff, like you eat your shoe leather, you boil it, I guess. But they're eating their horses and their dog. I don't know if they had cats, but they're eating everything they can, and they're certainly relying upon Native Americans as much as they can. But Native Americans are starting to get tense over time, and they're not exactly going to want to help their enemy, are they? And so that's wearing thin. And what do these people do? Well, they subjected themselves to cannibalism, and some of the worst cannibalism in that not only did they eat other members of the Jamestown community, they dug them up from graves and ate their corpses. I don't know, some food's best left over, but not human. Oh my God, just the most, it's amazing what a wretched experience Jamestown was. And sometimes we celebrate, sometimes we get so into this American patriotism and stuff. Like we talk about the city on the hill and all that kind of stuff, and how successful we were in terms of transforming this basically allegedly vacant land, which it wasn't. There's plenty of Native Americans here, and how it was all a success story. It was a nightmare. What changed Jamestown? What makes Virginia suddenly become prosperous? It's a plant. It's tobacco. And tobacco wasn't known in the European world, but it catches on like, no pun intended, actually, wildfire. It becomes huge. And tobacco gets a good price. It's easy to grow. And they bring in some other species of tobacco. I don't know if it's from Cuba or from the West Indies, those island regions, and it really is a high quality tobacco, if you will, and it grows very, very well in the Virginia soil, and it makes them all very, very wealthy. And these trading companies that went over that were going bankrupt and not bringing back any benefit at all, suddenly it takes off. And as a trivial pursuit question, why is it called Virginia? Well, the early English settlers were still honoring their great Queen Elizabeth. So why is it called Elizabeth? Because Elizabeth is the Virgin Queen, so it's Virginia after the Virgin Queen. She never married, allegedly never had any significant other in her life, and that's why she became the famous Virgin Queen. And she was very much English people and traders and things like that honored her rule, very popular rule during her reign. A better way of saying it. So what changed though? Why does it become? Well, they get off that freaking peninsula called Jamestown, which is just the worst place at all to live, and they move into the interior of Virginia to better lands, better waters. And they start doing a little farming. They start bringing over some husbandry, some animals and some better organization with people like John Smith and other people that are a little bit more practical about how to succeed. And then tobacco changes it all. They start getting wealthy. And then you have a thing called, I think it's called the head home. I call it homestead, but it's not. There's a process by which when people came over, they'd be granted a plot of land provided they used it for a period of time. And I think they had to split some of the profit with it. I think it's called the head share. And that was very lucrative. Yeah, the head right policy in 1618. Any person who migrated to Virginia would automatically receive 50 acres of land. And any immigrant who paid the passage of another got an additional 50 acres. So there's incentive to come over. That's the pull. And again, in England, what would be the pull to come over? Well, there was a lot of people in England that the feudal system was in collapse, so they weren't making money anymore. There was a lot of people that were really in dire poverty. So the promise of starving in a different place as opposed to home was still somewhat intriguing. At least things aren't going well here. May as well give it a shot there. What do you got to lose? And so Virginia becomes very successful. Shortly after Virginia, and it was supposed to be another group, were the Puritans. These people were persecuted back at home. We know their story. We're going to get into it when we do the whole Salem witch trial, almost on time, hopefully right in time for Halloween. Usually falls around that time every semester. It's perfect to be in the book for the Salem witch trials. But these people come over. They are seeking some economic benefit, no question about it. But they try to go, some of them go over to Amsterdam, too liberal to open a society for them. And they go back to England, they still feel persecuted. They don't think the Anglican Church can be reformed. They think it's too loosey-goosey, too popish, still related to Catholicism. They want religion to be more immersed into society. So they get to leave, and they go to the New World. And when they're on their way over, they're supposed to go to Virginia. They're supposed to go down there, but, technology, they're not driving in a beautiful Bayliner with, GPS. They end up in Massachusetts, and that's, the Plymouth Rock Landing. They make a mistake by, several thousand miles, and they start basically the Plymouth, the colony, and it's based upon religion, and they want to create a city upon a hill where they didn't even think it was necessarily permanent. They wanted to show people back in England that this is the way to live and this is the way to be, and it's that Calvinistic view of predestination, and your practices of faith didn't matter as much. It was you were predestined to be saved or not saved, but the more religious you perceived and the more obedient you were to the the Testament, the more likely you would be perceived as saved. Catch-22, right? So these people are over here for religious freedom, at least in the Massachusetts area initially, and this brings religion into the fray. They were pretty successful because unlike some of the other groups that went to Virginia and some of the people that were involved in fur trade, these were family units that came over. They were more a middling class. They weren't the most poor and impoverished, and they were pretty well organized. And those of you that like constitutional law, something I should have mentioned in the constitutional history class, while they were over, they actually developed a little bit of a democracy. Little. I mean, most, when I say very little, but it was something called the Mayflower contract, right in a compact, right on the Mayflower, the groups of the leaders, the elders of the church, and it was hand in hand. We have separation of church and state now, but our country wasn't born based upon that premises. Religion was very much enmeshed into the governance of our new world. And the Mayflower Compact was an agreement by the church elders that we would get together and agree on who and how the structure of a society should occur. Of course, you still had to be a very prominent member of the church to be elected, and you had to be a member of the church. You had to be saved to actually participate in the election, and you had to be an adult male as well. So it was a limited democracy, but the views of democracy were early born in our country's history, in the shaping of New England. And they wanted that purity of that church. And what's interesting, a lot of people think, I know I'm going really long and I apologize. A lot of people think, okay, our nation was based upon religious toleration. They were being persecuted back in England. They wanted to be in a country where religion could be not a badge of infamy and duress. Not entirely true. In fact, in some ways, it's contradictory. They wanted religious freedom for them as Puritans, but they didn't tolerate in other people. In fact, if you came to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in a few years and you were a Quaker, or you just had maybe a bit of a alternate view of the way in which religion should be interpreted, you'd be expelled if you didn't come into the fold. And if you didn't remove yourself, you'd be executed. Massachusetts Puritans actually executed Quakers. And if you know anything about the nature of the Quaker faith, it's probably, not League of Friendship, but Friendship Hall. They're very nonviolent, for lack of a better way of saying it, but they executed these Quakers for either refusing to leave or convert. So they believed in religious tolerance for them and them alone. You had to be a member of the church in good standing to really stay within the community and to be active in the community politically, body politic. You had to be a Puritan, a member of the basically later called Congregationalists. You had to be in the fold or you wouldn't get along. They outcast some very famous people. One is Anne Hutchinson. I might put a test question in about her. She said, well, I'm saved, so therefore I have the right to espouse my views about anything in religion because God has talked to me. And the preachers that I hear are getting it wrong and they're inappropriate. And so she challenged not only the religious leadership of the church, she challenged the male dominance of it. She's arguably one of the first female feminists to speak out. She was exiled. And where do you go if you're thrown out of your home state? Even, well, maybe not to this day, but it had a reputation over time. You go to Rhode Island. And Rhode Island became a bastion of religious tolerance for all kinds of different groups. And the other one, he was kind of a religious zealot, but he was a big believer in toleration of other groups. And that's, of course, Roger Williams. Roger Williams Zoo is named after him. Roger Williams University is named after him. He actually was a strong believer in the Puritan dogma, but he believed that people should live side by side with other people that don't have those same faiths and those same concepts. Book is very good. I actually love the book. I actually got a physical copy. Those of you that still trying to freak out, trying to find it, it's called The American Yelp. It's based upon a poem by Walt Whitman. It's a good book. It's solid. And don't be afraid to look at other resources. I'm going to try to put up some other videos for you in the next couple of days. I know these videos are long. You don't have to watch the whole thing. You don't have to watch them at all. I just feel obligated to hopefully participate in some way other than posting other things. Otherwise, I'm some kind of proctor, right? And again, don't be afraid to have a dialogue with me. Reach out, shoot me an email, talk. Otherwise, have a great weekend.